Well, Tom, I want to talk a little bit about an experience that you and I shared in the past, and that is a visit to Father Václav Malý in Prague. For me, it was a striking experience. In fact, I remember when I came back to the United States, there were and preached a few homilies and so on. I probably mentioned him in sermons, and I remember some of the parishioners saying, "Boy, that really had an effect on you, didn't it? That touched you deeply." And as a matter of fact, it did. You know, it's been well over a year since that happened, and I have never written anything about it yet. I intended to do it, never have. Someone suggested I haven't assimilated it yet. That might well be true. But I want to explore a little bit about that experience that you and I had, and I'm recalling that I would have never had it except for you, that you were the one who set this experience up for me and got me the opportunity to talk to this famous priest in Prague who was so much a part of the Velvet Revolution and worked side by side with Václav Havel in accomplishing this change from communism to a free system. So I'd like to talk a bit about that, and perhaps you could remind me of how it was exactly that you set this thing up for me.
Well, we don't have a lot of time, and it's rather complicated, but I had an opportunity to invite a theologian to come to Eastern Europe, and specifically we began in Moscow at a meeting which consisted of leaders of these Soviet governments from 100 Soviet cities. And after you had the chance to speak to that group of leaders about some of the relationship between religious beliefs on our cultural institutions, our legal system, our business attitudes, our attitude towards profit, and very important things in our way of life. And after you gave that very, I thought, very effective talk, and one which stirred the feelings and the hearts and the minds, I felt, of the people who were present at that meeting in Moscow, you and I went first to Warsaw. I think the purpose was so that you could rehydrate after, because you'll recall, Jim, I had trouble getting you to drink enough water. You distrusted the water in Moscow, and I wasn't sure why.
I recall that very well.
I had suggested,
I would rather that you didn't talk about the water in Moscow and talk about
I'm
Prague.
Here, I know, but I wanted the listeners to know that we tried to get you to strain the water through your teeth so you wouldn't be so afraid of it, and you wouldn't do that. After we had a lot of orange juice in Warsaw, we went on to Prague. Now, you told me that the purpose for being in Prague was to visit your ancestral birthplace, the place where your parents and grandparents had, from where your ancestors had come. And so while you did that, you sent me off on the mission of arranging a meeting with Václav Malý. I went to St. Gabriel's on the evening and was able to, after Mass, the church was crowded to capacity.
This is during the week, wasn't it?
During the week. It was a Thursday evening. The church was crowded to a standing room only, and I was able to go in and make a meeting. The following morning, arrange a meeting. The following morning, you and I met with Václav Malý at his apartment at 8:02 on Friday, and I might, to set the context, this was shortly after the Pope's visit.
Very important context, isn't it? Yes, very definitely, because we would talk to Father Malý about all of this, didn't we, about the Pope's visit?
We talked about the Pope's visit. We talked to Jim about his suffering under the communists.
I think we should explore that a little more, because remember when we went in his apartment, he lived in a tiny little apartment, and in that apartment he had his books piled up on his bed, which meant every night when he went to bed he had to move the books in order to lie down and go to sleep. There was no bathroom in the apartment. It was a rather cluttered place, had a telephone, and he showed us places where the apartment during the communist regime had been bugged, and that there was a camera at the door, that anybody who came in would have been seen as they arrived. He was constantly badgered by the police.
Interrogated more than 250 times.
Terrible. And one time terribly brutalized. As he said, he was in a room alone, naked, with these brutal guards and being beat up, and he was saying how vulgar they were and so on. And I remember him saying so strikingly, he says, that's when you find out about your faith. He says you have nothing to fall back on at that point except your faith in God. And I remember asking him if he drew on that experience, and he said he definitely did in his preaching and teaching, that that personal experience he had, terrible kind of thing, really has continued to enrich his own ministry as a priest. Remember, too, him talking about how he had the chance to be involved politically, a clear indication that he was offered a post in the government, decided not to do it, and instead to go back to parish life. I thought that was a sort of impressive part of it. I'm also remembering that how he talked favorably about his work. Remember, he worked as a stoking, what do we call it, boilers.
He was a stoker and a common laborer.
Yes.
And, and I think that what you're pointing out is very interesting because unlike many of the priests who were kind of conscripted and who kind of collaborated with the communist government, at least they did down until Dubček came to power in 1968, when there was a kind of loosening of the outright attempts of the government to control religion. But Václav Malý, unlike many of the priests who had become part of the kind of semi-official church in a
co-opted by the government.
He chose to align himself with the underground church. Not only the underground church in an institutional sense, because there wasn't an institution, but the underground movement, which contained a lot of people who were not explicitly Christians, but who were in favor of social reform. And as you point out, he told us that his faith and his theology was greatly strengthened by the experience of working with the common man. His school, yes.
Yeah, he called that his school when he was working stoking boilers. He got to know the working people. And remember what he was saying about how he found out that a lot of these people had no religion. They had grown up without in families, not religious background and so on. And he found out that you couldn't just assume things, but you had to present Christ in a new and appealing way, as he said. He had to call forth from them some other understanding of Christ. It sort of gave him his methodology that he continues to use, that you can't assume that people know what the great religious realities are about. You can't just go in and talk about sin or redemption or grace or revelation or Christ. You can't do that. You have to find some more common basis that the people already have and then speak about the great Christian truths in relationship to that. So it gave him a methodology that he's continued to use.
Yes, he talked about the fact that this experience taught him to listen to other people, accept them where they are, as they were, rather than being prepared with ready answers. In other words, rather than being the theologian or the pastor ready with a lot of pre-formulated answers to people's problems, because he was in a position where his right to continue as a priest had been revoked. They had taken his state license to be a priest away, which, of course, the licensing of priests is one of the ways the communist regimes in many Eastern European countries control religion. But that had been taken away, and now he was forced to be common labor. So what he had a chance to do was just listen to people and found out how they think and feel about the world. And then I thought, Jim, that experience was reflected a great deal in what I took to be and what I felt was a very mature assessment, a rich and mature assessment, which brought in a lot of psychology, a lot of history, a lot of practical experience as you and I and Father Malý reflected on what has been happening in Czechoslovakia and indeed throughout Eastern Europe.
Yeah, he gave us a lot of insights, didn't he, into the psychology of what happened during the Marxist regime. I think I got out of it that it really had a great effect on the people, maybe more so than what we thought. At one point he told us that it had touched the soul and the spirit of the Czech people, that constant repression that they lived under, and of course, as you and I noted, in the communist countries, the standing in line and the constant being watched by the police. He was always being followed and so on. But anyway, that wore down the spirit of the people as he saw it, and created in his mind a passivity, a sort of indifference. He said people had lost their ability to be self-motivated, that they weren't able to grab hold anymore. And remember, I thought an interesting thing, he said it would take 2 generations before he thought they could overcome that whole effect. Now, I was thinking, contrasting that with some of the things we noticed in Moscow, where there was this great religious revival, and it seemed as though, despite the whole effort of the Soviet Union for 70 years to stamp out religion, they couldn't do it. The religious spirit was there. Russian Orthodoxy was in their soul, and the communists couldn't get it out. Well, Malý gave us a little more negative picture, I think, of the really negative effects of a long-term communist regime. trying to propagate an atheistic worldview. People largely dispirited, I guess he gives a picture, and sort of indifferent and hard for them to motivate themselves.
Yeah, I found, Jim, that was very interesting, and also it created in my mind the realization of what a terrible paradox we have in Eastern Europe as it struggles to get out from under 70 years of communist control. Because, of course, Marxism teaches basically that through the mechanism of communist control of government, we are going to create a more sense of community and a greater sense of each of us as an individual within a social whole. And as you point out, Mali told us that quite the opposite has occurred, that people, because of the contradictions, well-known contradictions in the totalitarian makeup, I suppose is true of any totalitarian system, where the government takes responsibility for the public good and defines the public good and controls all that is of a political nature in the system, the individual loses any sense of individual involvement or responsibility. And so, as you point out, he indicated it's going to take a couple of generations, and as he sees it, it's going to take a great deal of involvement from the West, particularly on the part of people like yourself who are willing to come over and to share your views with these people before the idea of individual responsibility and the worth of the individual in a social system, in a system functioning not only with a church with its moral and religious norms to guide public policy, but in which all citizens have a sense of responsibility and accountability to the greater good. Isn't it ironic and paradoxical that in a system which in its ideology preaches that you're going to come to a greater sense of community and social responsibility, they achieve the very opposite?
Well said, and a telling insight in my mind. You remember how often he used the word isolation. He said what really happened from this communist system, which, as you pointed out, was trying to create some sort of a classless society and a communal understanding of life, it actually privatized life and isolated people. And a lot of that was around the notion of truth. He talked about how it became hard to speak the truth to one another. You know, you've heard those other stories often out of the communist system where even parents are afraid to tell their offspring what they're really thinking and feeling about the regime for fear they'll repeat it at school. Well, I got that same impression in talking to Father Mali, that a tremendous sense of isolation. Who could you trust? Who could you speak to? Very often it turned your thoughts in on yourself, broke down the natural bondings that you found. Even look how they isolated the church. Because you had this co-opted official kind of church, and then you had the underground church meeting in people's homes, carrying on their religious activities, ordaining priests, and so on. In fact, I think it was Mali was ordained, I'm trying to remember, I think it was 1967 that he was ordained. And, you know, within that system, I mean, there were all kind of clandestine ordinations. As a matter of fact, there's bishops walking around who claim they're ordained bishops. They're not even sure if they are. Rome's still trying to figure that out, because it was all being done underground, and no one was really sure who officially did these ordinations, whether some people who say they're priests are really priests or not. So it's created vast confusion. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons why he was so big on the Pope's visit. I remember him telling us, he says, I know the perception of the Pope is different in the West than it is here. But for us, he says, we have been so isolated, cut off from the rest of the church, that when the Pope comes here, he represents the universal church, the Catholic with a small c church, this larger body, and it begins to make us feel as though we're part of a larger whole. Remember, I think he had a lot to do with what the Pope said when he came there. I got the impression, I tried to push him on it, if you recall, and he wouldn't really say directly, I think out of a spirit of modesty or humility, but I have the impression that he had a lot to do with what the Pope ended up saying when he came there.
I did too.
Yeah, and one of the things he wanted him to say was that Czechoslovakia is part of Europe, and that this is all part of this larger church that we belong to. So that was his way of trying to overcome this isolation which you've identified.
Yeah, you know, and just to bring the Pope's visit back, he commented on the fact that the Pope had taken a highly pluralistic tone. In other words, he hadn't come in to that hugely complex political, social, economic situation that exists now in Eastern Europe and specifically in Czechoslovakia, and tried to come in with dogmatic approaches. He had come in and basically said, look, let's go back to the fundamental belief that the individual counts in. And once you start with the individual as counting in a deep religious and moral sense, everything else flows from that. Whereas, as you pointed out a moment ago, I think the actual word that Mali used was not privatized, although I must say...
No, it was my word,
with some trepidation, because privatize, when I talk to you in these matters, I bow before your greater learning.
It's a word taken from Johann Metz, a German theologian, who sees that as the great problem of modern times.
He used the word atomized, and I think that word atomized is a more dramatic portrayal of the notion that we're talking about when we talk about the deep social and political consequences of 60 or 70 years of communist rule. Because what I thought was interesting, Jim, was the fact he talked about that under Marxism, the basic idea was that history is working through processes which essentially work them out through class struggle. And in that system, the class struggle, the economic divisions, become the rationale for all political activity. That's the theory, the ideology behind it, that essentially we're in a class struggle. From that, the communists built a system in which one group of people, the Communist Party, arrogated to themselves the right to hold all political power and speak for the class. And they did it through I think, an inherently evil. I'm not saying the people were evil, but the system was inherently evil, because from that ideology came a police state technique of divide and conquer. So every individual had to be in fear because the state held all the political power of his own individual rights. And from that system, the individuals were told under this structured socialism that was referred to as communism, we'll take care. The state's going to take care of you. We'll take care of your economic needs, but you don't have to think about the social good anymore. Hence came this deep sense of detachment and irresponsibility that we're talking about. Now, I'd like to hear what you have.
Well, I'm trying to pick up a couple of those points before you take me in another direction because of what you had to say there. I'm recalling when I did visit my grandparents in a tiny little village in Czechoslovakia near the Slovak-Moravian border, that even there, this repression that you were talking about was operative. That, you think, why did they have to repress this tiny little village that had no political aspirations or anything? They had forced the people to go on collective farms, and even in that setting, they were intent on making sure that the people, if they were going to practice their religion, were going to be punished in some way. They were kept track of who went to church, and in some way or another, there was restrictions, travel, economic jobs, and so on as a result. And so it sort of spread that way and was repressive in totality. I mean, it affected the mindset of all the people. It's another point that you made that I want to pick up on, and that is his carefulness about words. He did speak in English to us, and his English was fairly good, but he had a dictionary in front of him, and he would periodically stop, quickly page through, find exactly the right word that he wanted to express in English this situation that he was trying to deal with. And that goes back to his sense of truth, the idea we must fight for the truth of every word. You know, that's something he holds together with Václav Havel. A lot of Havel's published works are on that idea. You must fight for truth, struggle for truth. Every word must be accurate. You can't exaggerate, you can't be off the mark. You must exactly hit the target with your language. And I think that came out in Mali's general approach to us and trying to get across to us exactly what his ideas were all about. Anyway, that struck me as you were talking there, and now before you launch on another long soliloquy, where did you want to go with that, Tom?
Well,
you want to go someplace else. Go ahead.
No,
tell me.
I was leading up to your impressions of his friend Václav Havel. And I think you ought to maybe tell the listeners who Václav Havel is in case they haven't been following developments.
Well, I mean, we're dealing here with the president of Czechoslovakia, playwright and general fine scholar, I think. I mean, a real man of letters in a sense, a man in touch with the people and with human life. But that interplay, Mali told us that they were best of friends. I get the idea that they talk every day on the phone kind of thing.
Very
and
close.
Visit one another, and that Mali has been a general supporter of his. I think there were times when the Velvet Revolution was going on that the group itself, Civic Forum, had various ideas about who might lead the whole thing eventually. And I think that some thought that maybe Millie would lead.
Yes, he was considered. He was considered. I thought it was interesting that he made it quite clear that what he wants more than anything else is to be a parish priest, to be a minister for his flock. And I was struck when I went to St. Gabriel's and attended Mass by a couple of things. First, by the deep sense of devotion I sensed in the people. There was none of this that we see sometimes in our churches here in America, of this people wandering around. The people were, or their eyes wandering all over, or a sense of distraction. These people were deeply involved in the liturgy.
This was a standing room crowd only.
Standing room crowd. It's not a large church, but keeping in mind this is right after working hours. I think Mass began around 4:30, I think it was. I would say there were at least 50 to 100, perhaps, people standing in the aisles around. In fact, it was so crowded, some people were actually standing inside the sanctuary.
You always amaze me with your command of languages and so on, and you do speak Russian quite well, and I've seen you operate in those circles. I think that's what impressed our Russian host so much when you gave your opening talk in Russian, and it did amaze me that you also knew some Czech, something that I really should know since that's my background. But I'm always afraid to ask, you didn't really understand his homily when you were at Mass,
No, I did not understand his homily, but I did have fun going around saying simple things. You know, you brought, I would say, "Mój sytel je českého původu." Jestem ruského původu. I would, but then what I just said was,
what did that mean?
My friend is of Czech descent. I'm of Irish descent. And then I would go on and say in Czech. Then I would go on and say in Czech. But even though he's of Czech descent, he doesn't speak a word of Czech. But we Irish, of course, care enough about the Czech traditions to learn a little of your language. And I would stumble through that.
I'm certainly glad I gave you that opening, Tom, to talk about that. But you did have a positive impression of this liturgy. He told us at one point that a lot of different kind of people came there, not just Catholics, a lot of Protestants came. He said even atheists came to his Masses because I think they were interested in his homily. Did you not tell me he also said a few words after communion that might have been of a more political nature?
He did,
as you picked
and
it up?
I knew just enough Czech to get the gist. And what he was basically saying was words of simple, concrete comfort. He was just saying, basically, we have many problems, but the best place to come to put all these problems into perspective is right here in the church. And his basic theology came through. He said a few words to the effect that essentially all the evil in the world is individual evil. And we may see problems in our society that are too big for any one person, but in the end, all of the problems we have that we could consider evil in our society come from individual evil. So he centers on Christ as the exemplar, whose example in loving and caring for other people is the perfect example of how to live a life in communion with God, and from that comes everything else.
I wanted to ask you something else, if you understood a point that he made. He was distinguishing Bohemia from Slovakia, and he said that the church in Bohemia was a minority group. That's what we usually would call the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, where my own grandparents were from. But and there, the Catholic Church is a minority, and he says they are not in danger of somehow getting into a power struggle. The church there will always remember, at least for the foreseeable future, that it is has a spiritual mission and won't try to take over political power. Then he was contrasting that with Slovakia, where the church is the majority and is in power. And he kept saying things like, well, they have a temptation. The church in Slovakia has a temptation to sort of get involved in a power struggle. And I wasn't really sure if I understood that or exactly what that was all about.
Well, I think it's fascinating, Jim, because this Czechoslovakian separation or cultural difference is very important. I think what he was saying, if I could have a crack at it in the little time that we have available, I think what he was saying is that in Bohemia, if you look at the history of Bohemia, the institutional church is not as powerfully entrenched culturally and historically as in Slovakia. The reason for that was after the Habsburgs came to power. Remember, in the early 1600s, 90% of Czechoslovakia believers were Protestants. They went with the Reformation. after the Habsburgs gained control in I think it was 1620, from that point on, basically the Czechs saw the Catholic Church as being controlled by bishops who were largely German and largely Habsburg in their history. So the church never was deeply rooted or as popular as it was in Slovakia. So today, in the historically maybe 20% of Bohemia would be Catholic, whereas about 60% historically in Slovakia would be Catholic, and hence the danger is the church is going to get involved in politics and dilute its pure Christian mission as a living institution reflecting on a person-by-person basis the importance of each individual and his and her salvation.
I certainly can count on you, Tom, to give me always this historical perspective and this cultural analysis. You never cease to amaze me that way. It's incredible. Well, we've been talking here about Father Václav Malý. Can you in 10 seconds tell me your impression of the man?
Deeply, deeply committed to Christ as the be-all and the end-all of the pathway to true love and service of God and fellow man.
We were in the presence of a really good man, weren't we? We were in the presence of someone who sort of moves towards what we usually think as sainthood. I mean, of a man very integrated, very together, and as you have well pointed out, I think greatly committed. Well, Tom, we've been talking about a great personal experience in my own life, and one and I'm very grateful to you to have set up for me this interview with Father Václav Malý. I've been thinking a lot about it. We'll probably write some things eventually. But Father Malý reminded us of the strong influence of the communist system in Czechoslovakia and how it's created a certain passivity among the people. But he's also pointed out some signals of hope, this quest for truth that lurks in the human heart. And I think he gave us a sense that really, out of that religious sense, that Czechoslovakia can take hold and really rebuild itself.